and Nami Multnomah. Thank you, Taylor and Nami Multnomah, for having me back. I worked at the Portland VA back in 2018 and 2019 and met Taylor through my work out in Portland, and have been doing this with her. I did one last year and this year, and so I'm happy to be back, and I'm happy to share this information with you. And hello to any of those who, I feel like some of the names look very familiar, so it's good to see your names again, and to have you back. So this evening, what I'm going to talk about is what is moral injury, why is it important, and then we're going to talk about what does it look like to host a moral injury group, and how would you start one, what would you talk about. So I'm going to share my screen. Just a moment to get everything set up. Okay, and I have my screen sharing, and then Taylor, I assume you're gonna like watch the chat, because I'm just gonna leave the presentation up so my screen isn't crowded, so I won't be able to see anyone.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Excellent. So moral injury and how to host a group for veterans. So like I said, I am a chaplain, or Taylor said I am a chaplain. I'm currently at the West Palm Beach VA Hospital. I'm their suicide prevention chaplain here. So I work 100% in suicide prevention. And a huge part of the work I do is moral injury work, because moral injury is directly related to suicidality. It's just really deep, important work. And as a chaplain, one of the beautiful ways I can be effective in helping folks heal. And so before we get started, I'm also really passionate about mindfulness. And so I want to just do a quick mindful moment for you all. I'm going to read a poem. And this poem is used in a lot of the moral injury work that I do, and that really started in Portland. And I will plug the Portland VA, the chaplain team at the Portland VA, their moral injury work. I was trained by them. It is phenomenal. So if you have not connected with the chaplains at the Portland VA for moral injury, I really encourage you to do it. Chaplain Morris, Chaplain Widmer. They're really amazing, fabulous chaplains and resources for moral injury. But in this mindful moment, I invite you to maybe close your eyes, turn away from the screen for a moment. Just take a couple of deep breaths. Really inviting yourself to arrive in this moment. Inviting yourself to be present, putting aside all that has transpired into your day before this moment, and all of the tasks and to-dos later this evening and tomorrow, just to be present right here. And I'm going to read a poem to you. I'm going to read it through twice. I want you to just pay attention to the words that you hear, what stands out to you, and what images come up. Paradox by Gunilla Norris. It is a paradox that we encounter so much internal noise when we first sit in silence. It is a paradox that experiencing pain releases pain. It is a paradox that keeping still can lead us so fully into life and being. Our minds do not like paradoxes. We want things to be clear, so we can maintain our illusions of safety. Certainty breeds tremendous smugness. We each possess a deeper level of being, however, which loves paradox. It knows that summer is already growing like a seed in the depth of winter. It knows that the moment we are born, we begin to die. It knows that all of life shimmers in shades of becoming, that shadow and light are always together, the visible mingled with the invisible. When we sit in stillness, we are profoundly active. Keeping silent we can hear the roar of existence. Through our willingness to be the one we are, we become one with everything. And then taking a good deep breath. It is a paradox that we encounter so much internal noise when we first try to sit in silence. It's a paradox that experiencing pain releases pain. It is a paradox that keeping still can lead us so fully into life and being. Our minds do not like paradoxes. We want things to be clear so we can maintain our illusions of safety. Certainty breeds tremendous smugness. We each possess a deeper level of being, however, which loves paradox. It knows that summer is already growing like a seed in the depth of winter. It knows that the moment we are born, we begin to die. It knows that all of life shimmers in shades of becoming, that shadow and light are always together, the visible mingled with the invisible. When we sit in stillness, we are profoundly active. And keeping silent we can hear the roar of existence. Through our willingness to be the one we are, we become one with everything. And another good deep breath. I read this poem for you because moral injury is a paradox. Healing from moral injury puts us in this place of paradox. We learn to live with both stillness and action. We learn kind of stealing from acceptance and commitment therapy, that diffusion, that there can be pain in the past, but we can live fully in the present moment, much like this picture. This might be a familiar image from the coast out there, that there can still be so much movement, and sometimes moral injury creates that hole, like the sucking hole within us. But yet there can be still waters. And what does it mean to live and navigate all of that? So my objectives for this evening is to briefly talk about trauma-informed care, suicide prevention for veterans, describe moral injury, differentiate moral injury from PTSD because they are different, current treatments for moral injury, address possible clergy approaches, both clergy and community member approaches to helping veterans with moral injury, and then when to consider how, when to refer veterans to mental health providers. So I would touch briefly on trauma-informed care, in case some of you don't know what it is. Trauma-informed care, I recommend that you go to samhsa.gov to that link at the bottom when you get this PowerPoint. Really some great resources, and maybe NAMI has some resources too about trauma-informed care. But for a program, organization, or system is really about realizing the widespread impact of trauma and you understand the potential paths for recovery. You recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in your clients, the family, staff, and others involved within the system. You respond by fully integrating this knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. You seek to actively resist re-traumatizing. So it is really about this approach of not do no harm, right? Don't re-traumatize someone, and have that approach in all aspects of care that you provide. So when we're talking about groups, we definitely want to provide trauma-informed groups, and from that perspective, because we don't want to make problems worse. And some of the 6 key principles to trauma-informed care is safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues. So keeping this slide in mind, right, as we go on to later when we talk about the components of a group, these are definitely going to want to be on your checklist, that when you go through, all right, we've set up our group, we have our curriculum, is it trauma informed? Are we being safe? What does it mean to be safe for our group of people, right? Are we trustworthy? Are we acting in a way that is trustworthy? Are we earning that trust? Are we being transparent about the work, et cetera, et cetera? So making sure that these components are always involved in the work that you do with anyone, but especially with moral injury. So suicide prevention, specifically within the VA, this is the model that we use. And this is my model. So I've taken the model from the VA and integrated my chaplain work into it. So just so you have an understanding of where moral injury fits into the work and kind of what, how it works into suicide prevention. So when we think of suicide alley, and we think of a stream. So if you see the stream kind of underneath the upside down triangle, prevention happens anywhere on that stream, right? So if we start at the upstream area, we have this idea of life promotion. So really you're targeting everyone, every veteran. Your objectives would be to foster those life promoting activities to prevent development of suicidal crisis. This could be from a clergy perspective, community clergy and leader training and outreach, community resource training and outreach, which we'll talk about some of those resources later. And really community engagement, events that foster purpose and involvement. One of the biggest, I think, that I have seen from my work driving forces behind suicidality within veterans is that loss of sense and purpose, that loss of community and connection. And so if we as community partners can provide that, it's a huge step in the right direction. And then if we go a little bit further downstream, we have that early intervention. This is individuals at a heightened risk for experiencing suicidal distress. We want to intervene early in response to known or potential risks, provide resources, training, and care to prevent further risk from incurring. So that could be groups focusing on stability, processing, and reintegration. And this is in many ways where moral injury fits in, is really in this, could be at the life promotion or the early intervention stage. Now, with the work I do in suicide prevention, I'm also often they're coming to me in that active treatment because they have high risk flags for suicide, meaning that they have recently had suicidal ideations, intent, plan, or tried to die by suicide. And so I'm not going to do the moral injury work right away because I want them first and foremost to be safe and have stability. So within active treatment, unless it would be really case dependent, but I really don't do the moral injury work at active treatment until, again, they have that stability. But more or less, that is the model. So when you think about wherever you work, whatever organization you work with or community you're a part of, maybe identifying where you work kind of within this, this format, if that is, it might be helpful. So dimensions of moral injury that are related to suicidality. So loss of meaning and purpose, perceived spiritual abandonment. God abandoned me, God left me, why did God let this happen? A lot of theodicy questions, PTSD and trauma, intrusive thoughts, religious or spiritual injury, grief and loss, guilt and shame, loss of identity and loss of moral compass, and betrayal and unable to trust self and others. So betrayal is really the key part of moral injury. Guilt and shame, betrayal, perpetration, huge parts of moral injury, which make up the core of it. So, question for the group: what are morals and how do we learn from them? And you can go ahead and drop those in the chat. And then Taylor, if you want to read some of them as they come up.
I don't see any yet. Oh, I see some. Societally taught rules and codes of conduct.
Yeah.
The difference between right and wrong. I would add like what I learned on Sesame Street or something, maybe.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, so morals are all of those things. We learn our morals from media, from TV.
Oh, we got another one. Sorry. Okay. Personal values, ethos, rules of our own, or the group we align with.
Yes. Yeah. alignment with self-code and contact, commonly accepted rules for living with other human beings. Yeah. Yeah, and so our morals are those sets of beliefs and values shared by group, shared by self. They come from community, culture, religion, family, again, media. So many different places that our morals and values come from. And I would argue that they're not fixed either. The morals and values we have as a 5-year-old, as a child, might not necessarily be the morals and values we have as a 50-year-old or whatever, right? They might be, but they're going to be more developed and more nuanced, right? And there's lots of models of moral development. You can go down that rabbit hole. That would be like a whole other training session. But it's important, it's interesting to look at that. What does moral development look like in humans? And where they come from. But just knowing, identifying really for yourself, where do your morals and values come from? The communities that you're a part of, where do they come from? And then applying that and understanding veterans' morals and values come from all of those places. And once they're in the military, they then have the added set of morals and values from the military, from whatever branch they're in, right? Sometimes they align and sometimes they're different. And when they're different, that's when we get moral injury and moral tension. Yes. So moral injury, there are 4 different definitions. How do I? The 4 main definitions of moral injury. There are well over 17 or more. Moral injury is kind of constantly being defined and redefined as more study is done, more research, and might be a little jaded. Every time someone comes out with a new book, there's often a new definition of moral injury. But these are kind of some of the core basics. When we basically, when someone, individual, a group, or a system does something that transgresses our deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. That's really the first one. The second, disruption of an individual's confidence and expectations about one's own or others' motivation or capacity to behave in a just and ethical manner. This can be brought about by bearing witness to perceived immoral acts, failure to stop such actions, perpetration of immoral acts, or particular acts that are inhumane, cruel, depraved, violent, etc. The third is betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. And then the last is stress resulting from witnessing or perpetrating acts or failures to act that transgress deeply held, communally shared moral beliefs and expectations. And I noticed that several of you defined morals based on the community you're a part of. So when something happens within the community that violates those community values, we can experience a moral injury. Some other definitions or some other words you might use as someone is explaining moral injury. And they're going to have, again, different nuanced ways of using these words. Moral affront, moral distress, moral pain. Moral pain often gets delineated out a little bit more from moral injury. Moral pain is the result of moral injury. Some say that moral pain comes before the injury. It depends on kind of what camp you're in, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Moral wounds, moral disruption, emotional injury, personal values injury, life values injury, moral betrayal, moral perpetration. On the spiritual care side, you would hear soul loss, soul wound, soul injury, spiritual injury, or religious injury. Now, again, people are going to define this a little bit differently, and essentially all talking about moral injury in some capacity or another. And to really kind of highlight 3 of the main definitions that are going to be important for us to really So you don't have to weed through all that. These are the three main ones that you will see in a lot of literature. Morally injurious events, which is a situation occurring in a high-stakes environment when an individual perceives that an important moral value has been violated by the actions of self or others. And I want to note that a lot of these definitions use the word perceive, that an individual has a perception that their morals and values have been violated. And I think that that's important to understand, because our values are individual to us. It's like, I often use this metaphor with my veterans. We put on a full face motorcycle helmet. It's got a full face visor on it, right? And when we've experienced moral injury, if you were to write the word betrayal and a black permanent marker on that visor, everywhere you look, the lens through which you see the world is the lens of betrayal, right? We perceive betrayal everywhere. Whether it's actually there or not, maybe not, but that it is real to that person and the lens that they're viewing and experiencing it through, right? So that's why I think it's curious to note that the word perceive is there. Moral pain. Moral pain is the experience of dysphoric moral emotions and cognitions in response to a morally injurious event, right? The injury, pain. Moral injury, again, the social, psychological, and spiritual suffering stemming from costly or unworkable attempts to manage, control, or cope with the experience of moral pain. And this is where some people say the pain comes before the injury. And I always think of, if I stab you with a really sharp object that you don't feel right away, the injury is there, but you might not feel the pain right away. And then some would say, well, you feel the pain sometimes before you feel the injury. So again, two different models. Any questions so far? I'm curious how many people have heard of moral injury?
I'll stop recording briefly if we want to chat for a moment.
Okay. So why is moral injury relevant? So the prevalence of morally injurious events among war zone veterans is 27% of soldiers endorsed facing dilemmas to which they were unsure of how to respond. Okay, so that's a pretty old statistic, 2008. I would say with the research that's been done now, that number is going to be a lot higher. And we're also finding that trauma happens, obviously, we've known this. Trauma happens not in the war zone. So when we're looking at moral injury, we really have to be cognizant to hold space for veterans, no matter whether they were in combat or not. Because our morality is always with us, and moral injury happens in relationship. So wherever there is relationship, there's the potential for moral injury. 11% acknowledged engaging in morally transgressive events while deployed, and exposure to morally injurious events as a risk factor for substance use, depression, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and behavior. There is now, like I said, there's a lot of really good research being done. I will plug the VA for this one. Definitely a lot of really good research between chaplains and mental health providers around moral injury and its connection to suicide. So, okay, so talking about paths of moral injury, I was talking about earlier moral pain versus moral injury. So from my experience in working with veterans, I've kind of come up with two different models. So paths, more or less. So in this first path, we would have, say we're a veteran, and we think about our moral beliefs prior to the moral injury event. So it could be, say you were 25, right, when the event happens. It's all of the moral beliefs that you have that have developed up to that point. And then you have the moral beliefs established in the context of the event, i.e. in the military, maybe it's combat, you're in garrison, whatever it is, but it's the moral beliefs within the specific context. And then you have the morally injurious event. From that injury is the pain. And then from that pain comes the suffering. So I use the analogy of food poisoning versus a food allergy. This would be a food allergy. So you ingest shellfish, peanuts, whatever, and you know, you go into anaphylactic shock, you know, within seconds, right, that you are having an allergic reaction. There is the injury is known in that moment. You immediately feel the pain, and then whatever the results are of the pain, you have to go to the hospital and get medication. I've never had that kind of reaction, but I imagine there's a little bit of suffering after the fact, right? But it's very clear the event that causes the pain. And so sometimes with moral injury, it's very clear what values were violated, what the event was. We don't have any doubt. And then the suffering, and really the suffering behaviors in response to that are going to be, suicidality, substance use, all of those avoidance behaviors to avoid suffering and to avoid pain that causes us suffering, right? The next way is where the pain comes first. So we still have the moral beliefs prior to the event. We still have the moral beliefs established in the context of the event. But first we feel the pain because we're really maybe unaware of the injury, or during the event, we didn't perceive the action or the acts as a moral injury. But then after the event, could be months, days, years, or decades later, all of a sudden, maybe we start into trauma therapy, or we start going into SUD rehab, right? We start trying to get sober, and we're all of a sudden like, we have some new insights and awareness. And we realize, oh, based on who I am now, or even the moral beliefs I had before the event and now, that event in the past, that's an injury. That actually did violate my moral code. Even though at the time I didn't feel like it. Now, oh, that is an injury. So some would say it's almost that, some would argue that's when the injury occurs, is when we have that new insight or awareness. Others would say the injury happened in the past. We just have that new awareness. So it's almost like a re-injury. And then you still have the suffering. So food poisoning. You go out to dinner, you have a cheeseburger, had some bad lettuce, bad cheese, bad meat, whatever. You get all the things that come with food poisoning, but it doesn't come on you until like 24 hours later. So now you've got 24 hours worth of eating food. You don't know what you ate, but you know you're sick. You know, you've got all the symptoms of being sick, and now you go back and you're like, oh, what made me sick? Oh, maybe there's a newspaper article that said, oh, such and such restaurant had a bad batch of meat. Well, oh, I ate that meat. That's what made me sick, right? So there's new sights and an awareness of this is what happened, and this is why I've been in pain and in these suffering behaviors. Again, this is just based on my experience, my own experience of moral injury, and what I observed and do observe in my veterans as far as kind of what the path looks like. And there could probably be an innumerable number of ways that folks experience this. I'm sure there's some mishmash way too, right? Because you might experience one moral injury one way, one moral injury another way, and then they like meet in the middle somewhere, right? But this is just kind of a general idea of the path that it might take, just so you have an awareness. Okay, so I'm super visual, and a group of veterans I was working, one of them had this, oh, it's like a moral amoeba. I'm like, what is that? So this is I keep this in honor of that veteran. This is a moral amoeba. So we have our morals in the middle, right? Those core moral values that we have that stay with us our whole life. They may flex and change, but they're with us, right? And the kind of the outline, the odd shape outline is life, flexing and flowing and moving, different contexts, moments in life that we participate in. And in each kind of arm of the amoeba, you have values of that specific context, right? Maybe you are on a deployment and you're with a particular unit of people, and they have their own kind of sets of moral codes and values for that unit, along with the military codes. Or maybe based on the context of that combat situation, there's very specific values, right? And when those values, someone acts against those values, you have a moral injury. Up in the top part, you have values shared across different contexts, right? Maybe you're a part of a group or several different groups, and you choose to be a part of these different groups because you align with their morals and values. So there's like this you share the values across these different contexts. And something happens. Maybe you do something that goes against those morals and values. So you can have the actual moral injury where there's a violation of the morals. You could have where the red arrows are just pressing in, but it's not a total injury or violation. That would be moral tension. Like, oh, that was uncomfortable. Something doesn't feel, side feels that yucky meter is going off, but it doesn't feel totally like an injury. That would be moral tension. We're in this irreconcilable tension with something, but it's not an all-out injury maybe yet. Maybe it could be, right? It's a place of noticing. So there's just to notice, there's different areas in life at any given moment in context in our life where there is the potential for injury, right? When we think we're a group of however many people here tonight, each of us has our own sets of morals and values. Some may align, some may not, right? That's how many different ways or points of relationship where there could be some sort of moral injury. That's a lot. Now multiply that by being in the military. That's a whole lot, right? So moral injury, when you experience it, it can cause you to feel, and these are really the most common things that we see with moral injury: guilt and shame, betrayal, depression, anger, anxiety, difficulty forgiving, grief, and loss. Now, it really can be quite a long list. There's a lot of other things that can go with it, but really at the top of it is going to be the guilt, shame, and betrayal that come up the most. And then the others kind of fall underneath that. But those are really the three core that folks will experience. So military examples, obviously in no way an exhaustive list. Acts of betrayal by peers, leaders, or self. Concealed acts of cowardice or failure to do duty. Again, that goes back to that communally held belief system. Exposure to body parts, discrimination, military sexual trauma, inability to prevent death or suffering, anything that results in an ethical dilemma or moral conflict, violence within military ranks, and death or harm to civilians. These are kind of like big issues. Moral injury can also be much more subtle. It often doesn't have to be these larger traumatic events. Moral injury can be very subtle sometimes. Someone asking you to lie about something or to change paperwork, or to just, let's just let this one slip by, right? That can cause a moral injury because it could go against a particular moral value of ethos and integrity and trust and honor, right? So I think I like to note that it's not always big and flashy trauma things, but moral injury is much more subtle sometimes. It is also in the eye of the beholder. So moral transgression is subjective, right? Subjective to the individual and the particular perception, understanding of their morals and values and perception of others' behavior. It's based on the service member's own moral standards, expectations, and interpretations. Based on his communally held morals and values, maybe also based in religious teaching of the community. Often when I ask veterans, what are some moral values that you believe in, that you have? I often get, inevitably will start listing off the 10 Commandments. Because I think within our Western society, I think those are deeply ingrained, right, wrong, or another. I think that they often just are. But then I'm like, I also will teach, okay, what are morals and beliefs from other religions, right? And we look at the differences, the different moral teachings, and they're often, a lot of them are very similar, right? Some moral injury symptoms that you might see, and I won't read through each of these lists. Taylor is going to send these slides to you so you can look at this in much more in depth later, but just touch on the biological and physical, insomnia, startle reflex, definitely SUD, maybe self-sabotage, self-harm, and suicide, the psychological and emotional injury. Again, the shame, guilt, grief, sorrow, loss of trust in self, self-deprecation, nightmares, social, definitely disconnection socially in every way, because you don't trust people and you don't trust community anymore. So any way you could be disconnected from family, community, and others, often they will feel that. And then spiritual injury, I would say definitely a lot of questions come up about God. Why did God let this happen? Who is God? What is God? Why? Just why did this happen? And what is my relationship now to God? Kind of the loop of moral injury thinking, and this is really definitely comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, which again we'll talk about later, is one of the treatments used for moral injury, ACT for moral injury. But you have really the contact with, I don't know how to. Can you all see the full slide? Because I have a bar at the top of mine.
Yeah, we can see the full slide. Don't correct me if I'm.
So you have just this loop, and folks will get stuck at one part or the other. And sometimes people are like, oh, I feel the whole thing. It's like, okay. But often there's a sticking point, right? So it might be losing contact with what matters, self-destructive survival strategies that violate our moral code. So it's like we have this moral injury, we have this pain, we're engaging in these suffering behaviors, which actually continues to violate our moral code. We're actually creating like new layers of moral injury. Self-loathing and regret, which brings us into the guilt and shame related to the moral injury and not being able to live up to our code. Unhelpful stories about why the code was violated and what this means, ruminating and worrying, and then the cycle just starts over and over and over and over and over again. So often you say, well, where do you feel most stuck? And that's where we can interrupt the loop. So we really want to help folks try to interrupt the loop at some point here with whatever tools, with the tools that we have, to just interrupt the loop and pause, take a breath. Whew. Noticing, the first part is just noticing they're stuck in the loop. That can help interrupt the loop. Right? So we use this model a lot to help folks kind of identify again where they are, where that moral injury really pulls at them. So when service members discharge from the military, and this is really, I think, talks to the disconnection from community, because moral injury, I think it's important to know, moral injury happens in community, whether it's you, whether it's one person, two people, right? And essentially 2 people for moral injury to happen. In context of community, it's 1 + 1 that is still community. But a moral injury happens in a larger group. It's community. Injury happens in community. Healing needs to happen in community. So, and I didn't mention, I'm also a veteran. So when we are removed from the military context, absolutely, not with, it's a culture shock when you get out. New language, new culture, new mentality, new way of thinking, new way of being. Like, how do I be this? And especially if you've been active duty and that is what you have known for years, you can feel very disconnected from a sense of identity, feeling out of place in daily life. And then if you add the moral injury to it, moral injury definitely takes that inner moral compass of, for some folks, it cracks it, shatters that moral compass. For others, it's just 180 degrees, right? But it can really feel disconnected from our sense of knowing. How do I trust who I am? How do I trust others? I don't know. I might be in faith and religious crisis, worried about being punished from a higher power for our role, or in the moral injury, depending on what it was, for actions or lack of action. And there are a lot of other ways service members will feel, but for some of us, these are, as we think of moral injury, some of the ways we might feel. So if you notice any of this in a veteran that you know, maybe become curious. I wonder if there's some moral injury there. Yeah. So overlaps and differences between moral injury and PTSD. I will say, first and foremost, PTSD index trauma is life-threatening index trauma. Moral injury does not need that qualifier. Moral injury does not have to be a life-threatening event. Like I said earlier, it can be much more subtle, but does not have to be a life-threatening event. So with moral injury, it's, again, less likely to be related to life-threatening events, but it can be, both and. There might be a spiritual identity, philosophical focus. There's going to be an avoidance, maybe wishing to protect others, not protect others. Definitely a lot less research in moral injury, less consensus on what moral injury is, and it's a much more narrow focus. Moral injury really lives in both the spiritual care world and the mental health world fairly equally. And I'm a strong advocate that they should never be separated, because it's both. You really have to address both spirit and mind for a moral injury. And being a chaplain, I am biased. I think spirit should always be a part of any healing, especially with PTSD, any trauma. But for argument's sake, especially with moral injury, it really does live in both camps. And so the care that is provided should come from both sides, should come from both that spiritual focus and mental health. PTSD, obviously going to be related to life-threatening events. They're going to re-experiencing hyper-arousal. They want to prevent re-injury. Definitely much more research, very concise consensus and definition about what it is. There's no ambiguity about what PTSD is. Moral injury, can be a lot. Where they will overlap, both are going to have avoidance and denial. Both are going to have intrusive thoughts, sleep issues, substance use. The negative cognitions experience, the guilt and shame, anger, disgust, betrayal, negative view of self. You're going to see social problems, trust issues, spiritual changes, fatalism, or sorrow. Yeah.
Rachel,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. This might be a good time to ask. We have a question in the chat, might be kind of related to this. If there are any statistics on the number or percentage of veterans where a moral injury experience can trigger a genetic predisposition to a serious mental illness. So might up to that time be dormant.
Wow, that's a cool question. I had not seen that research. Seriously, I'm writing that down. Say the question. Here, I'll look at it.
Yeah, well, it's a direct message, so I can read it again. Any statistics on the number or percentage of veterans where a moral injury experience could trigger a genetic predisposition to a serious mental illness that might have been dormant before? While we're talking, yeah. While we're talking about this slide, I mean, PTSD might be very similar. Or an experience that caused PTSD might.
Like I said, I don't know off the top of my head, but I know exactly who to ask. And so I will actually ask. And I will get back to you, Taylor, and then I'll see if I can't find some research articles and then share them. Thank you. That's a cool question.
Awesome. I'll send it to the group.
Part of me would want to say, yes, I'm sure there is the possibility that is true, but research, I'm not sure. But yeah, we'll look into it. Thank you. Yeah. Just another more specific way of looking at the overlaps and differences between PTSD and moral injury. I won't read through these. You can look at the slides later. But again, just kind of using the DSM-5 and where those overlaps and differences are. We are at 8:47. Do we want to do a quick break or keep going? Anyone need a 5-minute break? Okay. So, spiritual healing and moral repair are multi-dimensional. I want to read this quote. The moth and the caterpillar are no more alike than a seed and a sprout. Yet within the seed, the sprout is contained. In the disintegration of the caterpillar, the seed of the moth is watered, and only in the disintegration of the caterpillar can the moth become. And this is taken from Act for Moral Injury, Lesson 3, written in that particular modality for moral injury was written by Chaplain Rebecca Morris and Dr. Oh my gosh, this is horrible. Yeah, I will think of her name, but a psychologist. She works out there in Oregon. Oh, I feel so bad. I forgot her name. Anyways, it'll come back to me. Really using this idea of the caterpillar becoming this idea of transformation, that who we are, all that has happened, there must be this disintegration, this breaking down of all of that into this primordial type ooze, but within this contained shell, so that we can learn and grow and even struggle a little bit in the healing process, so that our wings are strong enough to break out of that shell. Jamie Lusk. There you go. Dr. Jamie Lusk. I knew I'd think of it. Anyways, so we can break out of that shell, of that cocoon that chrysalis that holds us in, and come out a new being, right? A new being, but still with remnants of all that was, right? And that is this idea, this transformational idea of healing from moral injury. Those morals stay with us, right? But they become changed. And we really have to be willing in moral repair to go into that breakdown a little bit. And that's why I can't emphasize stabilization enough to work on moral injury. Working with healing moral injury is not often something you'll do right from the get-go, right? Again, case dependent, but really there needs to be some stability, because this is like deep soul, philosophical, existential work, this healing process. So, but I've always appreciated Chaplain Morris's use of the caterpillar, because it holds so much truth. So some mental health treatments for moral injury, and these are 3 of the most commonly used ones. Impact of killing in war, where you're going to focus on self-forgiveness, therapy and or spiritual religious practices, and making amends. Adaptive disclosure, imaginary dialogue with the lost person, a guided dialogue with a forgiving and compassionate moral authority, and acceptance and commitment therapy, where present moment awareness, focus on values, committed action, self as context, acceptance, and diffusion. Again, if you want to know more about these, I don't want to go super deep into any of them. If you don't already know about them, look them up. If you are a mental health provider and it's within your scope to provide these, they are very useful for moral injury, especially acceptance and commitment therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy is definitely one of those interdisciplinary modalities that both chaplains and mental health providers can do together. And like the curriculum that Dr. Lusk and Chaplain Morris created is so beautiful, so impactful, and is just this perfect combination of weaving together both mental health and spirituality. But you'll also find in other VAs, chaplain departments, their moral injury programs will also integrate both mental health. And so that's what these next ones are. So some evidence-informed chaplain care modalities for moral injury found specifically within the VA. Now, there are moral injury programs outside of the VA. Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, with the VOA organization, she has a really good moral injury program now that she's created, where they have in-person groups. But I'm going to stick specifically to the VA because that's what I know the most. So building spiritual strengths, created by Dr. Harrison and a whole team of people that is both mental health providers and chaplains. This is a program that is an education in the definition, symptoms, and ideological theories about moral injury. You really define and describe clinical presentations of moral injury. You identify at least one evidence-based intervention to address moral injury, and then it is a 8-week program, 10-week program that really focuses on narrative telling your story, sharing your story, healing within the community. Again, and it's facilitated by both chaplain and mental health provider. The other program is Real for Moral Injury, created by Chaplain Czech, Dr. Smigelski, and a team of folks. And that is really an interdisciplinary group therapy for individuals experiencing moral injury. And Chaplain Czech is at the Oklahoma VA, so if you wanted to reach out to him and ask more questions about Real, I would recommend that. Carter Czech is his name. The group emphasizes self-examination of one's inner world and the morally injurious event through the lens of loss. It is a group therapy curriculum. It maintains a self-directed spirit. So really the person experiences the group, but is also there with their own personal self-inner reflection. Each cohort has unique needs and preferences, and really they use this really wonderful, flexible approach to meet those needs. And that in turn helps create a sense of trust. So some more evidence-informed care is the Act for Moral Injury that I mentioned, created by Chaplain Morris and Dr. Lusk, a 10-week psychosocial spiritual group that integrates both mental health and chaplain care using acceptance and commitment therapy. So really Dr. Lusk took the ACT model. Chaplain Morris took some really beautiful, profound ritual and mindfulness practices, and created just this symphony of a group, where you work on diffusion, present moment awareness, the spiritual processing of cleansing and purifying those moral wounds through rituals held in group. And when I use the word ritual, I mean time, space, and intention set apart for a specific purpose. And some of the rituals are done weekly to create a theme, but through ritual. Storytelling, making amends, and really learning to reclaim personal power when you're learning about acceptance and self as context. And then in the last phase, the process of values and committed action. And then the spiritual process of initiation, right? This is where you're starting to break out of the chrysalis, right? And that spiritual process of initiation looks very specific in that group and specific to Chaplain Morris because she has her own spiritual traditions that she integrates into the group. It looks different for what I do, and it would inevitably look different for what you do. I would encourage you. Chaplain Morris is still at the Portland VA. Her and Greg Widmer. If I would recommend you, if this sounds interesting to you, get in touch with them, talk to them about where they are with sharing this with folks on the outside of the VA. Or you can contact me and I can talk to you about it, but really since they really hold this curriculum and are the creators, I would recommend that. So engaging with community for healing. Again, the injury happens in community, therefore the healing should happen in community. So a question I would invite everyone to think about, you don't have to actually answer, but I also would be curious for you to drop in the chat and answer. What difficult conversations about war, conflict, trauma, and moral injury does your community need to have first before you can start offering any group or providing care for moral injury? What is the elephant in your room, essentially, in your community, at any of those topics?
We actually have another question in the chat.
Sure.
Probably not exactly related, but it is an interesting topic. So I don't know if you want to take a look at it. It's a little bit longer, or I can read it out loud. But
yeah, the MST question, and re-MST, who is being best served or protected in having separate groups for non-combat survivors and combat veterans? If there is detailed description of the traumatizing experience, it seems to me that this is not a subject that should be serviced in group, but handled one-on-one. So I will say, the question was about, does the VA offer MST groups? And yes, the VA does offer specific groups for MST survivors. The only folks in those groups would be MST survivors, but there's no differentiation between the MST happened in a combat or a non-combat or a non-deployment situation. And normally in a group setting, the specifics of a traumatizing experience would not be shared. but it's going to depend on what modality, like what curriculum the mental, because those groups are run by mental health providers. It would not be run by a chaplain. What specifically what the mental health provider is leading. But in general, I can say that group settings, you're not going to be sharing the graphic details of a traumatizing experience, right? They absolutely, that is meant for individual care. And any moral injury group, and I'll mention this later, not trauma processing groups. I'm not a mental health provider. Any group that I teach, I always start with, I'm not a mental health provider. This is not a trauma processing group. We're not, not that I don't honor what has happened to you and that it's important and you want to share, but that we don't need to share the graphic details of any event for both your safety, psychological safety, and the safety of the group. And that if you are going to start to share, if you do start sharing, know that I will interrupt you. This, for me, this is what I do. I just use a hand signal, and know that that is my polite way of interrupting you. I will reframe and try to understand what it is you're trying to communicate by sharing the story, how it impacted you. We can talk about how, so maybe your moral injury was, for example, MST. We don't need to talk about the details of the event, but we can talk about how it impacted you and what morals and values were violated. That we'll talk about, right? So I will often redirect folks back to that.
Thank you. The next question, I think in response to this question, is what to do now moving forward. So if you realize that a moral injury has occurred, maybe in yourself or, and then what to do now moving forward could be the elephant in the room.
Yeah. So what do we do? You notice that it's there in yourself or in the community. What do you do? I think often there's resistance to talking about feelings of guilt and shame for combat vets. Yep. I also do want to, yes, both in combat veterans, but in veterans, period. Guilt and shame, especially because moral injury happens. Trauma happens, both in veterans who have been to combat and veterans who have not been to combat. And guilt and shame, it is tough to talk about, for sure. War is a difficult topic to talk about. Trauma, mental health, especially within the religious communities, mental health, suicide, taboo topics, becoming less and less. Definitely depends on maybe the denomination, religion, church, part of the country that you're in, whether or not those conversations will be had. I can say that as a chaplain that works in the community, I have had easier times in different parts of the country finding religious communities willing to have these conversations. I'll leave it at that.
I'll pause because I think Dan is raising their hand. I'm going to pause. So
Damon, what can be difficult? What can be difficult in having both perpetrators and survivors in the stream? Yes. And so moral injury groups can be broken up to, and often how we do it in the VA sometimes is you'll have a group focused on perpetration and a group focused on the ones who were betrayed, right? But you don't have to, because even the perpetrators, because we're not sharing specific stories, it's all about how you facilitate the group and what is shared, what curriculum you use, in creating safe space for both the betrayed and the perpetrators. But yes, you can also do them separately. So, okay. Some areas to consider when addressing moral injury, when really looking to explore larger social, cultural, moral, and religious context. These are questions not for you to answer now, but for you to think about and ponder, really for you to answer later when you're thinking about creating a moral injury group in your community. I would think that divulging such a somehow impacts a service member's ability to remain on activity, given the fact that most people involved. What is your community narrative about trauma? What cultural beliefs exist in your community about morality? If you're within a religious community, what does your theology say about God or God's presence during trauma? How does your community respond to traumatic events? really. And at the core of that, facilitating healing through ritual, revisioning, and recentering. Again, using ritual, we have ritual in non-religious spiritual context, ritual again being action with intention, right? In a set aside space, time and space. Your Sunday football game, I'm sure if that is something you do, or a sporting event or a hobby, there's ritual in so much of life. So, other multidimensional factors to consider for moral repair. Body and this comes back to stabilization. Is the person sleeping? Do they need to reduce their stress load to create space, both physical, external, and internal space to do this work? Do they have some aspect of their physical health that needs to be restored? Restoring the authority of the prefrontal cortex, right? So they can move from that kind of fight, flight, or freeze, and move into engage a different part of the brain. The mind really starting to, can they tolerate intense negative moral emotions, the shame, the guilt, the anger, to do moral injury work? They need to be at a place where they're ready to start letting those be there, to stop avoiding those. That's why I'm saying stability has to be there. Community is their connection, trust, love, and community coming from the perspective of seeking justice and not revenge. That's really important. And then spirituality, God, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, religious practices. So there's going to be some common goals, again, for you to think about integrating. And really the biological starts at the core, and then you would work your way out. Community support. Why? Why is it important that community come together, veterans and non-veterans, to help other veterans heal? Because it's crucial for coping. There's a protective factor in community. Community can provide evidence that the world is in fact benevolent and meaningful, that the survivor is deemed worthy, whether you're the betrayed or the perpetrator. Community can model that, can really hold that for that person as they heal through their actions of compassion and empathy and helping them heal and do this work. That very relationship can be the salve on the wound. But if they don't engage with the community, if community doesn't step up and offer, that never happens, right? That connection never happens. And if you are clergy or you connect with clergy leaders, or religious leaders, and I would also say communities of meaning and purpose, and or spiritual communities. Those leaders can really function as an understanding confidant. Those leaders definitely need to know their lane. Again, when we kind of go into that, sharing traumatic details, maybe you are a mental health provider and that religious leader. Awesome. You can walk confidently and ethically in both worlds. But know your lanes, right? If you're a mental health provider, you don't have the religious training, know your lane. If you're a religious leader, know your lane, you're not a mental health provider. Groups in themselves become mini communities, right? So maybe you're not part of a larger community, but you want to start a group. That tribe, that group, the mini community that you create is where that healing can happen. Scope of practice. Yes, know your scope of practice for sure. Again, why is it important? Community. So especially with clergy, spiritual community and communities, members and communities of meaning and intention, really can be specialists in guilt, shame, forgiveness, restoration, community, and ritual. I mean, spiritual and religious communities, that's what we do. And for some, if you are involved in a religious or spiritual community, the leaders are seen as moral and ethical authorities. There can be many varying opinions about clergy, the power that clergy hold for a person as either an intermediary or representation of divine. It's all very unique to each path. Going to clergy and community members, definitely less stigma than a mental health provider. And guess what? When veterans discharge from the military, or you have someone who's in the reserves or National Guard, they're in your community. You see them before a mental health provider probably ever will, right? You are a frontline provider as a community member. So become trauma informed, do your due diligence and learn. If this is like you feel called to provide this kind of care, like get some tools. We'll talk about the tools, right? But educate yourself because you are that frontline provider. You meet the veteran in daily community life. You're a part, I tell clergy here and community members, you're a part of that veteran's life in a way that I never will be. I don't have the capacity nor would it be appropriate for me to be a part of it in that way. But you are. So you know them in a different way, in a much deeper, more meaningful way than a single clergy or VA chaplain could ever know them, right? And religious and spiritual communities are already built around common morals, values, and resources. Any community that comes together, you already have that shared morals, values, and resources. You can use those shared communally held morals and values to help that person repair the values that have been violated, even if they're the same or different. That established value system can be used to heal. And there are more of you than there are of me, i.e. VA chaplain. So why not try to educate as many people as possible? Because the more of us that are educated and know and can do, the more people heal and the better world we live in, right? If we're all a little bit healthier. Yeah. Okay, so to talk about specifically, all right, so this is the what next question. Okay, so you've identified in your community, you know that there are veterans, or you know that your community has experienced moral injury, and you want to hold a moral repair group. What does that look like? Okay, so this is the 5 phases of the moral repair group is based off of Judith Herman's 3 stages of recovery. If you haven't, it's really great writing, great resource, and it really works well with moral injury. So the first you would want to do is assessment. Now, if you're a mental health provider, this will make more sense to you. If you're not a mental health provider, you can still do a type of assessment. There are moral injury assessments out there that I'll show you those, that you can utilize and have the questions at the forefront. If you're a mental health provider, again, it'll make a little more sense. But really assessing the person's need for moral injury work. You could use motivational interviewing, engaging in maybe a conversation around theological meaning of suffering, or you could use specific moral injury assessment tools. Luckily, those do exist. The next part you want to start addressing is that stabilization, ensuring that that person has basic needs met and has cultivated some skills for managing intense emotion. They have to have some level of self-regulation and be able to sit with the idea, even at the beginning, sit with the idea of paradox, right? Sit with the idea that both pain and living fully in the present moment can exist. That the pain of the past can be there, can be, I tell me, on the other side of the river. Right? If you need to go visit that other side of the river, you can. But you can live fully in the present moment in a way that's in alignment with your morals and values right now, right? So they need to be at a place where they're kind of ready to be able to do that. And then those basic needs, food, housing, substance use recovery, etc. And then you would go into the trauma processing. Now, I use the word trauma processing. That's really specific to Judith Herman, but to Dr. Herman. And you wouldn't be doing the trauma processing, but just kind of as a model, right? You're going to be you're at the processing part. You're processing the moral injury. That is when the specific 8 to 10 week group that addresses what I'm going to call the 10 core components of moral injury. So this is where you employ the specific modality of group, the curriculum. And then you want to look at reintegration, right? You have the group, but then what do you do for reintegration? reintegrating that person back into community, having their committed action, following up with what does that committed action look like, going on the journey with them for them to help facilitate the integration of the work that they did in the group. And that's where community, you still got to be there. It's not a group one and done. You stay with them, right? Reintegration continued, further educate community, do welcome home rituals, have community conversations about trauma. Maybe that person becomes a peer support specialist, right? Continues the work somewhere else. And then continued support is creating that support structure in the community within, your community. Maybe again, it's peer support, replicating the process. Right? So for the assessments, these are the moral injury assessments that are used. You can look these up on the internet and find them. It'll give you, if you look through some of the questions, I would say the moral injury event scale and the moral injury questionnaire military version, and then the modified military, those are a little bit shorter. If you're not a mental health provider, looking through some of these to have an idea of what to be aware of when you're talking with someone that you think might have experienced moral injury, or you yourself. Again, if you're a mental health provider, using these and kind of going through each one and seeing which one kind of fits your context and would be most professionally appropriate for you to use. I'm always hesitant. If you're not a mental health provider, I think it's important for you to be able to assess, and that's really going to be a different conversation. And maybe that's where, Taylor, you could talk to folks maybe later, or, what tools are there to help community members assess people? I would say, I'll think of it later. Mental health training for community. I'm sure you guys have it out there, Taylor. Like mental health first aid. There you go. Taking some sort of maybe mental health first aid could be a tool. But, okay, so talking about stabilization. So some resources, knowing what's available in your community, and you need to know what's available before you engage with a veteran or anyone that has moral injury. So you're prepared. Like, you got to have the tools before you fix what's broken. So knowing what hospitals are in your area, what types of hospitals, where's the nearest VA or vet center, rehab centers, homeless shelters, housing and job assistance, food pantries, suicide prevention, mental health care, like some of these core basic needs, so that you can get them connected. And then what would be the skills for stabilization that you would want to either assess if they're there, or to provide? Some things to think about could be prayer, contemplative prayer, mindfulness, meditation, being able to create sacred space, engaging in religious life, any conversations about why religious and spiritual values are important, emotional regulation, again, being able to sit with paradox, even have a conversation about guilt and shame or grief and loss. Yeah, Taylor, and this is where I want to invite Taylor to share what NAMI might offer as far as like stabilization and resources that you all could tap into that's right there in your community.
Yeah, I was going to share our mental health resource guide that we have on our website, as well as, I'm not sure if all of you have seen the Street Roots resource guide. That's a really good one. We're actually leaning towards trying to shift our resource guide to be more functional in that way. Although I think our resource guide is pretty good at the moment. So you can definitely check both of those out. I was also going to put a flyer in the chat for all of our programs. I specifically wanted to note, sorry, let me find the file. I wanted to note our moral injury connections group that we offer. I know some folks here do attend that group, which is awesome. And then also I wanted to mention we have peer support specialists on staff. So folks can like get a peer support specialist. You can self-refer. So yeah, those are the main ones that I wanted to share.
Recommended training and tools that I would encourage you to acquire or go through if you have not already before you start a group. SAVE, suicide prevention training. Do you guys offer SAVE at all, or suicide prevention training, Taylor?
Non-multnomah? No.
Yeah, no, okay. So I know you can get a hold of the Portland VA. All VA suicide prevention teams will come and provide community SAVE suicide prevention training. There may be other organizations in your area that also provide it, but I highly recommend some form of suicide prevention training so that you're comfortable with having that conversation, making the referral. Red Badge Project, cool. Mental health first aid training, again, look for organizations in your area that might offer that. Invaluable resource as a community member. And this is for folks who are not mental health providers. This is for community members. You can be a mental health provider and take it too, but meant for community members. Really learning more about what it is for your group or community to be trauma informed. Lethal means training is really looped into suicide prevention training. And lethal means is going to be lethal means for suicide. So how do you help someone not have access to lethal means? Postvention care. When someone does die by suicide, what does it mean to provide care for that person or for the family members, caregivers, and folks that were in that person's life? TAPS is a really great organization. It is a national organization for postvention care that is run by suicide survivors, family members, and caregivers. Take all the moral injury and soul repair webinars you can. Like I said, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock has been offering some great webinars and some really good resources. She has a really nice balanced perspective on moral injury. Dr. Carrie Doring has written several books on moral injury. She is a pastoral care professor at Iliff School of Theology. Dr. Larry Graham is another good one to read when it comes to moral injury and soul repair. And then finding whatever webinar or training series you can on how to start a veterans, this one, other ones that might be out there. Other VA chaplains offer different trainings too. We all have our own recipes that are effective for us. So finding what works for you and for your community. Okay, so starting your first group. Learn all you can about moral injury. And there is no shortage of research and literature and books that you can read. Read to your heart's content because there's a lot. And then you need to, if you're going to be working specifically with veterans, identify the veterans in your community. How you do that is up to you. There's lots of different tools you can use. And it can be a little bit of a rabbit hole, but and if you just know people, like you're in a relationship and community with people, knowing their story, and then screening in whatever way, again, is appropriate for you to screen for moral injury. Again, PTSD does not need to be present. Please include all veterans, not just veterans who've been to combat. Please, please, please include all veterans. So many groups, nonprofits, and this is just my own personal shtick, only provide care to veterans who have been in combat. And I'm not saying, like, all people need care. All people need to heal and be whole. Trauma happens everywhere. Now, someone who has a combat trauma, is that going to look different? Is it going to be different? Conversation different? Yeah. But please, when you think about doing a moral injury group, include everybody. Now, your moral injury groups might be to a specific demographic within the veteran community, right? Just be intentional and have a really good reason, informed reason of the group that you're going to serve, right? Look in the chat. Oh yeah, okay, good resources. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing those. Okay. Identify the subgroups of veterans, i.e. women, LGBTQ plus community, Vietnam, post 9/11, etc. Like, again, it depends on the community you're in, the demographic of veterans. You can really tailor the group and how, and the group that you serve, that is really going to kind of dictate, obviously, the morals and values and kind of the perspective and the core issues that you're going to be addressing in the group. So again, be very intentional if you want to have a betrayal or perpetration group. And within that, do you want to have a subgroup, or is it just general to veterans? Do you want, so again, just be intentional, be thoughtful about how you put that together, that group together. Identify and create, procure your curriculum, practice it. Do it yourself. Any curriculum that I teach, it is curriculum that I have already been through. Dan can tell you, I was in the acceptance and commitment. I went through the whole series too when I was out in Portland as a co-facilitator. I was an intern there. I went through it 3-4 times, the whole year-long program, right? All of it. Because to truly, and this is my perspective, my model of being a group facilitator, to truly teach, you must embody. You must know it in your body, in your soul, in your mind. You must model it. And I think when we're talking about moral injury repair, that's part of creating trust. Is that, and veterans will know if you're BSing. That is one thing for sure. We see BS like none other, right? We know when someone's not being authentic. We know when someone's just speaking, but they don't mean it. So really, I encourage you, whatever curriculum, even if you go through it yourself, like a workbook, do some of your own work so that you can model it and be authentic about what you're teaching, and so you understand it. Space. Schedule a neutral, comfortable space that has ease of access. I would say is non-sterile and is comfy. Again, we're doing this deeper soul work, a lot of unpacking, a lot of that disintegration. And people need to feel safe, comfortable, and at ease so they can go into that vulnerable space, right? So again, whatever that looks like for your community, whatever space you have access to, help make you feel safe for people. Safe spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally. Create flyers, send emails, talk about it, send reminders, 2 weeks out, 1 week out, day of group. Taylor, you are so amazing about sending out reminders. I thoroughly appreciate all of them, and I hope everyone else does too. I am a part of a lot of webinars, and some people don't send out so many wonderful, intentional, you literally sent it. It was an automated email. Hey, this group is coming up, right? People need reminders. Make the extra effort to send the reminders. And snacks. Snacks are always amazing. Have snacks if it's appropriate for the group. Always have snacks. Drinks, water. Again, it's about helping people feel comfortable and welcome. So they can open up. So bring snacks. Okay, so the 10 cores of moral repair, and this is really, again, based on experience, and the themes, some of the main themes that you could teach within a moral repair group. So if you weren't using, and this is really, if you're not using an already established curriculum, maybe you're pretty competent and maybe you are an educator, right? And you feel like, I want to create something. So if you're going to create your own curriculum, your own lessons, these are the topics you're going to want to hit. So first, introduction, what is moral injury? Review, stabilization, and religious coping skills. So start re-practicing. If it's I do mindfulness, any of my moral injury groups, I do 5 to 6 weeks of mindfulness and contemplative prayer. That's all. I don't even talk about moral injury yet. I make sure that I know they have some sort of, at least those skills, so that when we get into the moral injury, again, they have some self-regulation skills. And then you want to identify the morals that have shaped the person from childhood through present moment. So you could do some form of moral mapping. just having conversations. This can look, you could, if you're an artist, you could paint this, you could write it, you could create, like you can be really creative, but it's just about identifying the morals, where they come from, what are they, no judgment about where they come from or what they are, just identifying and acknowledging that these are the morals that I have had throughout my life up to now, and this is where they came from. Then you want to connect the values to morals and exploring how the morals were violated by the moral injury. So this is where you have to be very clear about this not being trauma processing. This is where you want to be clear with, we're going to talk about our values and how they were affected. Not what was the action that violated them, but kind of what has been the impact of those morals and values being violated. Right. And then if you feel comfortable or you want to partner with a clergy person and talk about theodicy, that question of where was God when this happened? Why did God let this happen? And even with folks who don't ascribe to a religion or spiritual practice, sometimes still have this question. Like, I don't understand, or why did the universe let this happen? Why did this happen at all? Right? Creating space, again, appropriate for your community to address this question, but why did it happen? And then going into guilt and shame, the betrayal and perpetration. Whatever your experience and knowledge is of guilt and shame, whether you're coming from more of that mental health perspective or you're going to come from a religious framework. And I would say if you're coming from a religious framework, please be intentional and thoughtful about your theology of guilt and shame. In a way, make sure, I would encourage you for it to be trauma informed, right? Because sometimes theological conversations about guilt and shame can actually make the guilt and shame even worse. So just be intentional about it in a way that, again, is appropriate and fits your community. Talking about forgiveness, going into lament and grief. What does grief look like? Allowing space for lament. This is grief as being this active process, lament being the process within the grief. Restoration and reconciliation actions. Start them thinking about, okay, what does restoration and reconciliation look like? Is that appropriate? What does it mean to live in the present moment, live in alignment with my values right now? Even though the values were betrayed and hurt in the past, I can live right now. And in that, there's restoration. In that, there can be reconciliation. And then committed action. And that committed action being whatever it is, it could be a special project, something, an action that they choose to create in their life that is in alignment with their current values, and actually have them make a plan. Use whatever planning tool makes sense to you, but make a plan. And then the last week being a celebration, a welcome home ceremony. Dan can share, I don't know if Dan has shared with you the welcome home ceremony that they do at the end of Compassionate Warrior training. Is so powerful, so beautiful. And I would say arguably the most important week of all of it, is that welcoming home to self, welcoming home into community, and for some, welcoming home from combat, from the military. I think our Western culture does not do, and my perception does not do a very good job in sending away and welcoming home veterans and service members. So welcoming them home, and welcoming them truly into community. Yeah, it's just powerful and important work. Okay, so I just want to talk you through a sample group orientation. And again, you can read through these slides later. But during orientation, you're going to want to set the stage for the group process, giving them group members a chance to voice concerns and fears, leader transparency, set group rules and norms, overview of the process, and really what are the goals of the group. You're going to do introductions. You're going to introduce the group name and the curriculum. And again, they should already, by this point, if they're in the group, know at least a little bit what it's about. Give them a little bit more information. Again, go over group rules, barriers. for them attending group, and just to make sure that that group is in fact going to be a good fit for them. And then preview the group styles. So this might be reading a poem, asking a few questions, maybe doing a mindfulness practice, and then having a list of materials you might need to bring with you. You know, always come to group, show up, be early, be prepared, have your stuff together, because that makes a difference, especially with veterans. Don't be a soup sandwich, we call it. Don't be ate up. Come, have your stuff prepared, be ready, because that communicates trust. And it communicates your intention and that you value their time and you value the process that you are inviting them to. When you are there on time and prepared and ready to go and saying, I'm here, I'm waiting, the space is ready, right? Details are important. Again, these are all just ideas for how you could lead a group. Leader introductions, maybe having everyone say name, veteran status. You know, if you're the facilitator, you know, your name, veteran status, your expertise, maybe a fun fact. Veterans could say name, branch of service, fun fact, whatever kind of, you know, introductions make sense for your group, and, you know, a little bit of an icebreaker. And here's just a short silent exercise that you could lead everyone through. And then you could state, you know, we are doing 10 90-minute sessions once a week. Again, we ask you not to share details of your trauma or betrayal in the group. We do ask you to reflect on the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors you have because of it. Group is interactive. You can interact and share as much as you like. You get out of the group what you put in. Identifying that some of the activities may be foreign, strange, or they may be totally familiar. That's all good. But people have a choice to participate in any activity or not. That person is in charge of how fast they move. There is never any judgment about their process. There's never any wrong, only curiosity into learning, right? Some group intentions, potential barriers. Again, these are just suggestions for a group format for that first group, and things for you to consider, right? How do you want the group to be? We'll save questions for the end because I do want to be aware of time. Activities for reintegration. Again, these are just some ideas of things that you could do to help that reintegration process and the meaning making of everything that they learn and do and open up. And start to heal and mend within the group. Having this stuff set up before you start the 10-week or whatever curriculum that you do, right? So that there's no gap in care, essentially. So that person finishes the group, they can go right into those continued reintegration activities, right? So you just you do a warm handoff from one to the other. And maybe these activities exist already in your group. And part of that person's committed action could be identifying, okay, what are you going to do for more reintegration, right? And helping them get connected to that.
Reintegration, having these activities set up. So, yeah, I think just for sake of time, I'll just pick up here. Having these set up for folks before the group ends, being able to connect them because you are getting to know them and you're in a relationship with them. Being able to do a warm handoff to an activity that would be appropriate for them. Again, these are just some ideas. So a question, what does your community already do for meaning making and community building? And what are some ideas for an activity that could be moral injury focused? I'll have you kind of hold that question and think about that, right? Because you might not have to recreate the wheel. The wheel might already exist in what you have in your community. Continued support, going through NAMI's peer support training, SAMHSA, train other leaders in your community, invite graduates. Dan is a beautiful example. Dan went through the program, became a peer support specialist, and now he is continuing the work, right? creating an ongoing mentor group, and also continuing education and dialogue within the community around the topic of moral injury or grief and loss, guilt and shame. Right? Oh, good question. What is going to be your committed action? Really thinking about that, you know. Do you want to start a group? If you do want to start a group, what kind of curriculum is it going to look like? What resources and tools and training do you need to start that group? A lot of questions to really ask yourself what you would need. And knowing your scope of practice, kind of staying in your lane, knowing when to refer a veteran. When that veteran is suicidal, homicidal, maybe they need medication, they become disruptive to a point that it goes beyond what you're able to help them work through. The veteran's symptoms don't improve. Or you're at your wit's end, right? Maybe you do a group and you're working with someone and you just are truly lost, so you don't know what to do. Ask for help, right? The veteran's needs go beyond your scope and skill to be able to provide. And this is where having your tools ready and your resources ready so that you can refer that veteran. And making up your list of numbers and community resources to be able to refer. You can refer to your, if obviously it's a veteran, to your nearest VA, Veterans Crisis Line, which the number is now 988, which I think is great. So much easier to remember. The nearest ER, maybe taking them down to the ER. Community mental health clinic, maybe their primary care provider, and if appropriate, a VA chaplain, if you connect with your VA chaplains in your area. And then here is my contact information. If ever you want to get into contact with me, maybe if you want any help creating a curriculum or accessing or getting connected to the curriculums that I mentioned. Yeah, so that's what I have for you. Questions at the time that we have.
Thank you. I will stop sharing, or I'm sorry, stop recording.
Yeah.